Alright, this is going to be my first YouTube video. This is going to be removing and diagnosing fuel injectors on my 2008 JK with the 3.8 liter. As you can see, fuel gauge right now, car's not running. I'll show you what the symptoms are and what I'm going to do to fix it. Not sure if you can hear me with the noise, but as you can see, fuel pressure is around 60 psi, which is perfectly normal spec for this fuel pump. That's not a problem. The codes I'm getting are P0172, P0175, which means the fuel mixture is too rich, and it's in both banks. So I know that it's not isolated to one side or the other, but I'm definitely getting some leakage, which you'll see here in a minute, and I think that it's because the former owner put in a set of injectors that are maybe subpar. What I'm going to show you is when I shut the key off, watch how fast the pressure drops. So it dropped about 8 psi as soon as I shut the key off. If you read some of the manuals, they say that plus minus 5 is within spec. Some other postings online say that you should expect a slight drop after the key shuts off, but they never really tell you what that number is. I have another JK with a perfectly operating fuel pump, and I can tell you that when I shut off the key, the pressure holds at 60 psi and stays there for like 45 minutes. So as you can see, just as I'm talking, the pressure continues to drop. One of the things I did was put a clamp on the intake side, or the fuel delivery side, so this goes to the fuel pump. I clamped this off. This one goes to the fuel rail, and the pressure dropped even faster when I shut this off, telling me that I'm losing a lot of pressure out the fuel rail. So this gauge is just an Amazon gauge from any of the kits with a standard Schrader valve on it. The trick for the JK though is that it has these quick disconnects on the intake and the fuel rail. So you have to buy this little adapter, which is a MOPAR 6539A. that has the quick disconnect fittings on both ends. When you look online, you can get these anywhere from between $40 and $50. I tried to go to Amazon and price out the different components, the quick disconnects, the fuel rail barb, and the hoses, plus the T-connector. To DIY it is around $50, so I figured I'll bite the bullet and buy the real one. So from here, I'm going to disassemble all the components to get down to the fuel rail so that I can diagnose these injectors. First step with most of this stuff is to disconnect the negative terminal of the battery, especially when you're working with fuel and this fuel line's so close. You definitely don't want to spark, shorten anything out, and blowing up in your face, literally. I always put a rag under these just in case the battery terminal cable decides to fall back down on the negative terminal. That way I don't have to worry about it later. Next thing we're going to do is take out the air box, disconnected from the throttle body, get the throttle body disconnected with this clamp here, as well as taking out the intake air temperature sensor here. So I'll show you that in a minute. All right, disconnect the IAT, set that aside. This hose clamp off here. Pull that out. Right here, which you can't see on the video too well, there is the another hose on the back side of the filter housing. Take that off. And then the entire filter housing literally just snaps out. And we'll set that aside. All right, next is the throttle body itself. Take off this connector here. There are 4 bolts. We'll take those off as well. And then this whole thing will slide out. All right, so for the electrical connector, you push on the tabs closest to the wiring there. I know working on Jeeps mostly, you never know what connector does what, but push on the back. It's going to be snug. Slide it off. Set that aside. The bolts for the throttle body are 8mm, and I'll save you the boredom of watching me take all 4 of these off. All right, throttle body's off. Next thing I'm going to do is take off the hose here to the PCV valve. I'm going to take off both ends. You don't necessarily have to. You can fold it out of your way, but I just want to get good access. Next, I'm going to take off the MAP sensor, which is right there at the top of the motor, top of the intake. I definitely like to use these purpose-built hose clamp tools. They just make it a lot easier, especially to get into tight places, instead of using vice grips. But you can use vice grips or just a pair of pliers as well. This one's a little trickier. Which is another reason why it helps to use one of these tools instead. And the MAP sensor, just a electrical connector again. You slide off, turn the MAP counterclockwise past this little tab here. And you'll find the spot where it just wants to lift right out. Good to go. All right, next will be the evap hose, which is this guy right here that just literally pops off. Careful, this is fairly rigid plastic, so you want to move it out of your way, but you don't want to kink it up. The next one will be the EGR tube, which is this guy here. Not the easiest thing to do, not too bad. So it routes down here, and if you can see way down in there, right about where my finger is, it connects right there. There's 2 bolts down in there. It routes up and around, and then it's held in place usually by a bracket that keeps these 2, which is your EGR and your fuel line, away from the tube. Prior owner apparently at some point during his maintenance didn't get that bracket back on. It usually goes right there. So normally the procedure would be disconnect those 2 tubes from the bracket, and it's sort of like shaped like a C. So the fuel tube goes in the top part, the EGR goes in the bottom, and it keeps them separated but also down away from that EGR tube. And then there's a bolt that holds that piece on. Take that bolt off, take it off. Then there's one more bolt that holds this little flange for the EGR tube. So the flange is still there. You can see, I think you can see, but it's not connected to anything. It's just kind of sitting on there. So there's 2 bolts down there where it connects to the actual EGR valve, 2 bolts up here. Also be careful, there is a gasket down there. You don't want to lose or damage. Chrysler recommends you replace it every time you disconnect the EGR tube. Depends on how old or how bad that is. As you can see, because of the lack of that bracket keeping it away, the EGR tube on here had literally melted a hole right through it. I temporarily fixed that with a piece of 10mm rubber tubing just to get this thing running. Lots of check engine codes on this bad boy that I'm trying to work through so I can get it up and running. So I will come back after I've got this EGR tube taken out. All right, so quick public service announcement. To get to those EGR bolts, which are the ones that you can see right there, the end of that tube coming down with the corrugated metal around it, shielding. The best way to get to these bolts is through the wheel well. So there's lots of videos out there on how to remove the fender liner from a JK, so I'll spare you that. But get that fender liner removed, get up in there to get those bolts out. It'll make your life a lot easier rather than trying to bring a ratchet down from the top. These are 10mm bolts. I forgot to mention in the beginning, both top and bottom. So next time you see me, this will be off. All right, so I mentioned earlier that Chrysler recommends you replace the EGR gasket every time you take the tube off. This one's in pretty bad shape. I also noticed that the prior owner apparently lost one of the bolts and substituted two different size bolts in the attachment there. So correction, from the factory, these are supposed to be 8mm bolts, top and bottom. I just happen to have one 10mm bolt stuck in there. So this is off. I'll take the top off and then we'll get ready for the actual manifold. All right, everything's removed. Evap tube pulled off. Remember to be careful with that. Sorry about the dog. We've got 6 bolts for the upper manifold. Here, 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 and then way back in the back underneath those hoses. You just kind of push those wires out of the way, no problem. One over here as well. That one's a little tricky. There's 2 of these coolant tubes here. What I usually do is drop a long extension down between them to get to that last bolt that's back there in the corner. And we've got this one, this one, this one. So 8 bolts in total. They are 10mm, and I'll be taking those off. And I love finding stuff like this, these little golden nuggets of working on someone else's car. These are the upper manifold bolts from the factory. This is from gosh knows where. So I got that to deal with too. Hopefully I won't find anything really surprising under this manifold when we lift it off. And that's what's next. As you're taking it off, the last thing you'll see is the brake booster hose on the back. Make sure that comes off. Easier said than done. Good to go. Check to make sure all our gaskets are there. And they are. So that is what we're after. Fuel rail right here. This bad boy. We are going to take out these 4 bolts, and this whole thing will lift off with the injectors attached. And what I'll be doing then is starting the fuel pump without starting the motor, obviously, and looking for leaks in these injectors. The other thing that I would highly recommend is that you take shop rags and fill these holes in the upper manifold, well, in the lower manifold, so that nothing falls down in there. If you lose a bolt or a socket or something like that, that's going to be a real trouble, and that's a whole lot more work. All right, got the lower intake manifold blocked up. I'm going to take off these 4 bolts for the fuel rail. And then finally, in order to get the fuel rail out, we'll need to disconnect the actual electrical connectors to each of the injectors. Just pull out like that. Now these bad boys should pull out. We'll see how this goes. One's free. There we go. And already I can see one covered in fuel, which means the clip is probably not on there all the way, but that'll be our next test here. Don't know if you can see this or not focusing very well. That particular injector is pretty munged up down in there. Despite all the mouse pieces in here, the seals look relatively good. I am going to clean all that up before I put anything back. Alright, so after I blew the pressure on the one injector, I took a hard look, and it looks like a lot of the injector connectors, whatever you call these things, retaining brackets, were not holding up well, and the pump was only putting out about 48 psi with the engine off. So if these things were blowing at 48, and I know at 60 there's probably some other leakage going on. So I ordered some new retaining clips, and while I was at it, new seals for the top, which are the blue. That's where they go into the fuel rail there, as well as the little O-rings down at the tip, because a few of them were missing. Then there's another O-ring you probably saw from the video. They were kind of a light brown color that are at the very top of where the injectors plug into the manifold. So I'm going to go grab those from Napa. Thankfully they're still open, even though we're in the middle of the lockdown for coronavirus. But going to do that, clean these up, and then reinstall it. Actually, before I reinstall it, I'll do one more pressure test. Alright, back from my trip. New gaskets. So these blue ones go on the upper side of the injector, the part that actually fits into the fuel rail here. The brown ones are going to go on the bottom. They're the ones that seal down inside the manifold. And then I also got new clips to clip those to the fuel rail. So I'll spare you the boredom of watching me put all these on. The only thing I'll say is that you need to lube these up a little bit to make them easier to get on. So I've got some just regular old motor oil, which is recommended by Chrysler. I'm not Billy bobbing this, and I'll show you the finished product here in a minute. All right, so I put the new seals on the injectors, put them back in the fuel rail. I was able to get the pump to get up to 60 psi without the motor running, and actually left it overnight, holding steady at about 35, which isn't great. Prior to this, it would be down to the 10-15 range overnight. Good news is, it's not the injectors that are leaking. You can see pretty clearly. That's a shadow right there, not not dampness from gasoline. So injectors are good. The one that blew out before, with new seals, everything looks good. So I still have a leak, but I believe that it's at my fuel pressure regulator or the fuel pump itself, which shouldn't be causing my rich condition. If anything, that should be causing a lean condition. Something maybe to look at another time. Right now I'm more interested in seeing if I can fix the rich condition. Knowing that the pump is putting out 60, 61 psi when it's running, and no more than that means I should be in good shape. So now it's time to reinstall the fuel rail back into the manifold. One of the other things I did right before I put in this fuel rail, I cleaned out the wells here where each of the injectors goes. Basically took a rag, not a cotton, or excuse me, not a paper towel, because I didn't want anything to get down in there, but cotton towel that had been washed a few times already, so it didn't have any fuzz on it. Coated that with carb cleaner, took a screwdriver and basically rotated it in a circle down inside of each of these to clean them out as best I could before we insert those injectors. So the next step is to set the fuel rail and the injectors in place. What you do is set the right side, so this side from our perspective, set these in place, get them inserted, and then do the left side. The reason why this is backwards is because when you're reading service manuals, or anybody who writes service manuals or instructions should be talking about right side, left side from the perspective of sitting in the car and not over the hood like we are right now. So right hand side in this case would be passenger side, left hand would be driver. The reason why they don't just say passenger driver is because if you're working on a right hand drive vehicle, then those sides would be flip-flopped. So they just use right side, left side, again from the perspective of sitting in the vehicle, no matter what side of the vehicle you're on, passenger or driver. So we'll get this fuel rail set in place and get this thing bolted back in. So something else I forgot to mention, obviously we had about 35 psi in the fuel rail. I definitely didn't want to be pushing and tugging on these things and have one of them accidentally pop off and spray a bunch of fuel everywhere. So I need to get the pressure out. And the way I did this was I rigged up this little guy here. So I've got just a set of clips that go on the battery, feeds into here. And then right on the back side, I rigged up these two little connectors into the back. Hopefully you can see that. So all that I need to do now is attach this one to the positive terminal and then tap very gently on the negative in little spurts to get this guy to spray fuel down inside here and relieve the pressure. So we'll do that right now. And if you're doing this, you don't want to leave it on constantly. The maximum you want to run one of these injectors is about 5 seconds. I'll just give it a few little tweaks and you can watch the gauge go down in the background there. All right, fuel rail's in. The one thing that I didn't mention earlier was that I added a little bit of engine oil to the O-ring seals just to get them to slide in a little bit easier, but they went in pretty smooth. You don't have to push hard. They'll kind of make a little pop, for lack of a better word, when you get them seated, so you don't have to push hard. Just get this flush and you should be good. 10mm bolts, 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the spec is 200 inch-pounds or 17 foot-pounds of torque. Okay, also just as another test to make sure that the injectors themselves weren't leaking, I ran the fuel pump, boosted it up to roughly 60 pounds, and then clamped off the hose that goes back to the pump slowly, because last time I did that, it pushed the pressure to close to 70. So very slowly closed off the clamp and then shut off the fuel pump. So that clamp isn't 100% closed. I don't think I pinched the hose all the way, but you can see the pressure's still holding pretty good, 58, 59. It's losing a little bit, but I think that's coming back through the clamp here. And if you look really closely at the injectors, which I'll give them another once over just to be sure, they're not leaking that I can tell. So fuel rail's back in, tested the pressure, also connected all the harnesses. I'm lucky enough on mine, amazingly, that all the harnesses are configured so that I didn't have to go back and label any of them. You can tell pretty clearly which one's the long one and the middle one and the short one, so no big deal there. If for some reason yours have had the harnesses modified, I would definitely recommend labeling them before you take them off of the injectors. So next step, didn't show this on camera, I cleaned the surfaces of the lower intake manifold here. Didn't scrape, I just used degreaser and some carb cleaner and a rag and just got some of the gunk off. It really wasn't that bad. Next thing I'll do is pick all the stuffing here out of each of these intake ports and then put the upper intake manifold back on. The other thing I did was cleaned up the gaskets a bit. They come right out. I usually use a pick and just pick right underneath that little blue tab. Pull them out, take a Q-tip inside, and then apply some oil to them and put them back in. Did the same thing with the gasket for the throttle body. So I'll get this set on here and then I'll show you how to torque these bolts down. Alright, so manifold's been put down, the 4 bolts hand tightened. The torque for these should be 105 inch-pounds, and they have to go in a specific order. And what that is, this bolt here, so there's one back there you can't see. So second to last one, cross over to this one, go to this one, cross over to that one. So the 4 in the middle, you crisscross like an X. Then you do the front 2, start with the left to the right, remember driver passenger, and then start with the left, do the right. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 105 inch-pounds. Also, I neglected to mention in the back there is the brake booster hose right there. Don't forget to connect that before you lay this back down. It's hard to reach back there and get to that. Also, it's hard to get back to that last bolt. So if you have a U-joint type socket, that's going to make things a lot easier. All right, upper manifolds back in. Do a couple easy things. Evap goes right there. Easy enough, simply pushes down. I'm going to do the map sensor in the back. Again, push down, twist, and then stick the electrical connector in there. And then I'm going to do the EGR. Now, one of the things I also did was I bought a new gasket for the top. So you can see this one's pretty cruddy. That literally goes face down right there in that hole. Bought a new one from Napa. That's this guy here. If you'd like to see the number, 70696. Also a new gasket for the EGR tube that goes down underneath the one we had to get to through the wheel well, 70721. I'll replace both of those and get that EGR tube hooked back up, and then next time you see it, the map sensor will be there as well. All right, two things on the EGR. One is this face here. Do not scrape this. Scraping the edges here breaks the seal. So if you read the factory service manual, it says don't use abrasives on this. So we'll just use some carb cleaner and a rag. No big deal. These bolts at the top, extremely important not to use power tools to put these in. The top of the manifold is basically plastic, and those screws, if you use a air ratchet, will strip it right out. I did notice, courtesy of the prior owner, it's hard to see what these are on the camera. These are actually swirls of plastic from the screw threads that I pulled out of here. I just noticed a little pigtail hanging out when I replaced this gasket. So it looks like they Bubba tighted these things at one point. I'm hoping that the screws that came with this thing are okay. MOPAR does make a kit for larger screw types if you do this. Lord knows how much that's going to cost if I have to use it, but apparently it's a common problem, so they actually make a larger thread screw for those two in case you do something like this, but we'll cross our fingers and hope that doesn't happen. All right, EGR tubes back in place. The bolts that go on the EGR valve way down there, those are 11 foot-pounds of torque, 8 millimeter. But if you remember earlier in the video, I have 1/8 and 1/10, thanks to someone's prior maintenance job on this vehicle. The top bolts here are also 8 millimeter. I do have two of those. Those are spec'd to 106 inch-pounds. But if you remember the stripping pieces that I found, I was woefully afraid to even torque them down that tight. I got it to where the EGR tube is there. I could feel them sort of spinning, and I just stopped. So hopefully that holds. If not, then we'll be replacing those bolts at some point. Next is the PCV tube. So one end connects right there, the other end back there where the PCV valve is. Just spring clips, no bolts, no torques to worry about. I'll put that on and I'll be back. All right, now for the throttle body. That simply slides right in there. There's no flange or anything, so it doesn't hold itself on. You've got to get one of these bolts started, otherwise it just falls off. But once you get that on there, the torque specs for each of these 4 bolts is 65 inch-pounds, and they recommend that you also tighten this in a crisscross pattern. So it's this one first, that one, this one next, that one, and then don't forget to reconnect the connector here for the throttle body. Throttle body's on. If I forgot to mention, these are also 8 millimeter bolts, and 65 inch-pounds is not a lot. It comes in a hurry, so do not over tighten these. That gasket's really sensitive. So next will be the air box. Basically, we snap it in right there, connect this hose right here to the side, and then the main housing goes right there. When we're done with that, we've got the IAT here, intake air temp sensor. That's going to go right in the side of that corrugated hose. So no inch pounds, no torques to worry about. They do say that for that screw that tightens the banding strap here, that it's 35 inch pounds. I don't know anybody who uses torques on a screwdriver. I certainly don't, but you know, if you're curious about that kind of stuff, 35 inch pounds is the number. I'm just going to tighten it till I can't tighten it anymore. All right, everything's back in place. Last step is to reconnect the battery right there. Fire this up, and hope I didn't break anything or forget to connect something back up. Stay tuned. Okay, everything put back together. The car started, which is great, but I still have a rich fuel condition. So it was not the injectors, although the pressure is relieving a lot more slowly than it was before. So I do think I had a leaking connection on that injector on the back side. So next thing I'll be doing is replacing the fuel pump.